Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of our Shared and Halved series of webinars. I hope it's as sunny where you are as it is here. It's an absolutely delightful day. So we will keep this webinar to 1 hour because I'm sure you're intending to go out in the garden this afternoon. I certainly am. We are focused today on the issue of the road to economic resurgence. As many of you who have been on these webinars before that have been hosted by Shoesmiths, we've been focusing on the furloughing scheme or the active measures in the interventions that our government have been taking. But today is a subtle change. We want to focus on the resurgence, the inevitable resurgence, I should say. So for the next 60 minutes, we want to fill this online room with a strong sense of optimism. Any panelist detracting from that will receive short shrift. We want our audience to go away feeling very optimistic, at least maybe until Sunday when Boris may bust that bubble, but let's hope not. So I'm delighted to be joined today by a fabulous panel, and which I'll now introduce to you all. Turning to Kitty Usher first. Kitty is a chief economist at the think tank Demos and a board advisor to a banking fintech also. She is a self-described policy wonk. I'll ask her to perhaps elaborate on that in a moment. But relevant to this call, she is the former Cities and Treasury Minister in the Gordon Brown government at the time, of course, of the 2008 recession. Therefore, Kitty would have been actively engaged in the aftermath of the Northern Rock collapse and so forth. Kitty, do you still have the scars from 2008? That's a great start.
I find myself investigating.
Then, Kitty, so you can start again. Sorry. What a great start.
How about that? Can you hear me now?
You're back. Yes.
Great. Apologies for that. Technology not my strong point. So yes, definitely have the scars, and sadly find myself investigating them as we consider the whether this crisis has any similarity to the past.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Kitty, and we'll certainly come on to those similarities in a moment. Lee, good morning to you. Lee has been working with us now and our clients during this COVID crisis on a number of matters around public affairs, etc. Lee is a former special advisor to the government, or I should say previous Conservative governments. I think known as SPADs, aren't they, Lee? So Lee is he's also a former Conservative MP and is helping us to get our messages across to relevant departments in government. And I think, Lee, it's fair to say the government are listening.
Yeah, certainly on some of the points we put forward, the government has indeed then acted on them, and in a very positive way. So yeah, I'm hopeful that some of the ideas that are obviously going to come out today can go forward through the entire panel and will make a difference.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Lee. Turning to my colleague, David Jackson. David is head of our national commercial team and also heads our COVID-19 task force, which sounds fantastic. To talk to about that. David, what's the most challenging aspect for you during this lockdown?
That's a good question, Vac. I think, like many parents, probably balancing a pretty challenging day job with homeschooling 2 kids under 10.
Right. I think many of us can relate to that for sure, David. Although I can see they've done some nice pictures for you in the background as well. So, Stephen, turning to our final panellist, Stephen Kinnock, Labour MP, and recently appointed Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacifics in Keir's new Shadow Cabinet, also quite a relevant role for today's call. Stephen's known, as many of you will know, for his leadership on cross-party Brexit matters, and of course has an instantly recognisable surname. I'm curious, Stephen, is that a hindrance for you today or a help?
Oh, well, if you ask my dad, he would, of course, say it's only helpful. And no, he's a great guy. We always have a good chat, but I have to say, I think we spend more time talking about Welsh rugby than we do about politics.
Good stuff. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for all the participants. I can see the many hundreds who have joined us on this call, and thank you for those who've submitted those the questions in advance. Now, we've received some 130 plus questions, so you'll be relieved to know that I'm not planning on asking all those questions. So apologies for those who I'll end up missing, but we are keen to continue to engage with our clients and our friends on this call. So, do please get in touch with either myself or David, who, as I said earlier, chairs our task force, or your usual Shoesman's contact if you want to continue the engagement. We're very much doing that as a par with all our clients at the minute. So, right, I wanted to kick off with a general question for all of the panellists. And it's really to do with kickstarting the economy post-lockdown. Perhaps let's start starting Monday next week, and how we get back up and running after the lockdown, and how we really get business motoring again. I'll mention 2 or 3 questions that have been raised by participants, and if the panelists can try to address those as well in your comments on kickstarting the economy. Soraya Fenton, Argyle Fenton. Thank you so much for your question. She asks, what key insights can the panelists provide that will best inform industry's response to recovery, irrespective of any specialism? What do we need to do that we might not be doing presently based on what you know and can predict? Great question. Rupert Young of Nerton Developments. Hi, Rupert. And people are talking less about a V-shaped recovery and more about a U-shaped, or Rupert writes here, or a skip-shaped. Now, I've not come across skip-shaped before. I'm not sure, Rupert, whether that's one of yours. David puts his hand up. You've heard skip. I'm presuming we mean a mini skip, not necessarily a large skip, but what's the panelist view on that? And finally, Liz Reynolds of FMG. Interesting question here. The UK was slow to implement containment measures and compounded by Brexit. That makes an appearance. It seems likely that, therefore, that the economy will be worse affected and slower to recover than any other nations. Do you agree? Lee, do you want to pick it up there?
Yeah, fine. I'm someone who believes passionately that the glass is always half full, not half empty. And I think kickstarting the economy, we have to be frank and say we're not going to come out from lockdown immediately, as the question was stated, and go back to normality. That's not going to happen. It will be a gradual work back to normality, but it's important that is as quick as possible. I think some of the things that need to be addressed are both employee worries about returning to work, consumers' worries about going back into the workplace or into a retail or leisure environment, and also I think we have to say that the banks are going to have to be very understanding as well. And we'll come on to that later in questions when they pop up. But I genuinely believe that the economy will recover. I believe we can work together across all sections to make sure that happens. And what is really important is there will be a time for party politics. There's no question about that. There'll be a time to reflect on what went right and what went wrong. But the initial thing we all need to do is make sure lives are safe and to get back to as normal, or whatever the new normal is, as quickly as possible, and I believe business can thrive. If I can touch on Soraya's question, and that is, there is going to be, whatever industry you're in, a new reality. Whether that is working, no more hot desking, working in a space from each other, or in a retail environment, only X amount of customers or consumers being allowed into shopping centres and shops at any one time, that will take some getting used to, both for the companies and also for the clients. If we then look at the facts about whether we're going to be worse or better affected than any other country, I'm not sure it will be much different. Different countries rely on different industries. If you look at Spain, for instance, they're very heavily reliant on tourism. That's going to take quite a while to recover, for people to have the confidence to fly, the airlines to fly. But I genuinely believe, in answer to the entire question, that we can come out of this with a V shape. It may flatten off and plateau a little bit once the initial, if you like, I don't know about anybody else, but I will be going back to the retail. I will be going back to leisure. And I'll be going back to my office as soon as possible, if only from the stance of my wife will kill me if I don't.
So Lee, thank you for that. So you're with Rupert on a sort of a mini skips shaped recovery.
Yeah, even though I've never heard of the skip shape before, I'm with him.
Yeah, no, thank you. Kitty, your thought?
I'm very much enjoying the skip analogy because it kind of implies that the bigger the skip, the more rubbish you've got in it, which kind of seems appropriate since that means you'll have a longer recession. I think the first question is a brilliant question. What should industry do regardless of what sector we're in? And it completely ties in with the government's approach to this right at the beginning back in March. The best thing that industry can do is to think, what do I need to do to be able to be as economically active as possible? Now, for some sectors, that'll just simply mean making some adjustments, maybe moving a bit online. For other companies and sectors, it will mean a massive pivot in order to open up new income streams in the new environment that we find ourselves in. But the government's approach from the start has been to simply try and mothball rather than destroy the economy. That was the purpose of the furlough scheme, to keep as many existing contracts in place so that there's no permanent scarring of the economy. Now, there will be some scarring, I think. So accept, internalize our new reality and simply try and trade. Do whatever it takes to try and trade. And the point that Lee made, that there are a lot of worries out there, workforce worries, obviously business owner worries, consumer worries, those need to be overcome. So in order that economic activity can happen. So consider, what are your worries, what are your team's worries, and tick them off one by one so that we can get the economy moving again.
I think, Kitty, you mentioned the expression "whatever it takes," which was obviously, the initial reaction from Rishi and others when this first hit. Whatever it takes, we'll get through this. There's a sense from many people that they are pulling away from that. It's interesting you mentioned that just then. Do you sense that the government are pulling away from that message and retracting that slightly?
Well, there isn't a kind of open blank check here. And so when the science permits greater opening up of the economy, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that soon, then the government will want the economy to return as much as possible. And as an extreme, the kind of most extreme moment will be when they decide they're not going to extend the furloughing anymore, because that's affected a wonderfully large proportion of the economy, some up to sort of 50% of or 60% of some sectors, accommodation and food and so on. And when they say, look, we can't do this anymore, that will then force the pivot and force the change. And that will happen at some point. So every single business out there needs to think, well, what am I going to do then? Am I going to lay those people off? Hopefully not. How much of my previous capacity can I bring back on? And how much profit, fundamentally, can I make? And what do I need to do to achieve that? There'll be a lot of structural change. We don't really have any official economic forecasts, and we have a sort of what the Office of Budget Responsibility, the official government agency looking at the economy, we have what they're calling their baseline scenario, because they don't dare call it a forecast because there's so much uncertainty. And their baseline scenario is actually V-shaped. It's presuming that the economy in 2021 will be pretty similar to what they had thought it would be had this not happened, with a couple of skip-like elements in there, a flatter bottom, unemployment higher, debt higher. And
we'll come back to that in a moment, Kitty, and because I'm quite keen to hear from you as an economist on some of that. So just turning to David and then Stephen, just really your sense of optimism on the kickstarting the economy, David?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's clear that it won't be return to business as usual for many months to come. Requirements for PPE, new working patterns and other social distancing measures in the workplace. I mean, getting back up and running is going to be a logistical challenge, to say the least. And obviously, strategies for school reopenings and safer public transport will also be key to getting the workforce re-engaged and the economy moving again. And although perhaps not Lloyd's place to mention it, surely wide-scale antigen testing is also going to be crucial in getting as many people back into circulation as quickly as possible, pending an available vaccine. But in terms of government stimulus, I think they're going to need to consider how existing fiscal support might be continued through the next phase, assuming a gradual re-emergence from lockdown. The key areas for me are going to include continuing the furlough scheme, but perhaps adopting a sector or workplace type approach so that the support is more targeted to those areas where a workforce return isn't feasible. For example, hospitality, rather than the current one-size-fits-all approach. And indeed, that includes the move to the reduction in level of support to 60% that we're hearing about currently. I think government support packages need to move from being reactive in nature, so those designed to keep business on life support, to being much more proactive or rehabilitative in nature to help businesses get back onto their feet. And I know one of the things that's been discussed is a potential call for tax cuts. So, for example, a temporary cut in the VAT rate to encourage us to spend our way out of the crisis, which is interesting, although I think the last time this happened in 2008 when they reduced the rate from 17.5% to 15%, subsequent economic studies showed that the GDP impact was negligible and that it actually caused depressed consumption once the rate was restored. So it will be interesting to see how the government approaches that whole issue of tax cuts. And I think one other point to note, obviously, is the Bank of England has already cut interest rates to 0.1% and announced a £200 billion quantitative easing programme, which is the equivalent of a further 2% rate cut. So arguably, it's fired all the conventional weapons in its arsenal. So I'm really hoping that Boris's V-shaped expectation comes to pass, because I think that's what we're all hoping for.
Yep.
But obviously that relies on there not being a second wave in the pandemic.
Thank you, David. And Stephen, David mentions tax cuts. Will Labour be supporting tax cuts?
Well, I think tax cuts which are progressive and which are designed to stimulate spending and get consumers back onto high streets, I think can work. But we certainly won't be supporting tax cuts which just would end up repeating the mistakes of trying to recover from the 2008 crisis, where those who were least able to afford the cost of the crisis had to bear the heaviest burden. So I think everything that we do going forward has to be progressive. And I think there's obviously, whenever there's something big happens, you end up with alliteration of the answer. And I think for me, it's the 3 R's. It's rescue, recovery, and reform. We've got to be all hands to the pump now in terms of government schemes which have been welcome. But I think that the loans should have been 100% backed by government, because that would have really speeded them up. That's what they've been doing in countries like Switzerland and Germany. So that was a missed opportunity, and it meant that the loans going out of the door ended up going out too slowly. Then I think in the recovery phase, absolutely about identifying those sectors which are going to take longer to get back on their feet, particularly hospitality and anything which is customer facing, really. And that means, I think, making the furlough scheme more flexible, enabling short-time working rather than the one-size-fits-all approach to furloughing that we have so far, and avoiding the cliff edge on the 1st of June, making sure that those industries that are still struggling don't have a cliff edge in terms of all of the measures of government support that are there. And then I think the big third R is about reform. As I say, don't make the mistakes that we made after 2008, where there was a choice between investment-driven recovery and austerity-driven recovery. And from 2010, the government chose austerity. And I think that was a fatal error, which in many ways made us less resilient. And it also, I think, gave rise to populism, which, of course, we're seeing the effects of that in terms of a lack of global coordination now in terms of the response to the crisis. So never let a good crisis go to waste would be my watchword on this.
Yeah,
and
just
3 key words: rescue, recovery, and reform.
I'm just picking on that last one, Stephen, just very briefly, reform. Just a brief answer to this. Do you see the Johnson government repeating the same actions around austerity that we saw post-2008?
Well, what was interesting, of course, is with Boris Johnson's so-called levelling up agenda, there seemed to be a recognition that austerity was actually a political choice, not an economic necessity, because he was already talking about pumping large amounts of money into infrastructure and having a more investment-driven growth model, and things like HS2 getting the go-ahead, etc. So there was a movement towards investment-driven growth. I think that it would be a fatal error to now see the crisis as for some reason, moving away from that. So I'm hoping that the shift in government thinking that was already happening before the crisis will be accelerated by this crisis and not reversed by it.
Yeah, okay. Kitty, you're nodding with Stephen on that.
Yes, I mean, there was a really important kind of footnote to the budget on the 12th of March, that 11th or 12th of March, that now seems like ancient history. But for the first time, the official government documents acknowledge that the more you spend on capital investment as a government, and in this case it was the levelling up infrastructure, particularly in the north, the greater the return you get to the GDP of the country's wealth. Now, this is an extraordinary thing, because what it means is the more you invest, the richer you come, the more you invest, the richer you get. And it implies that you should continue to invest your way out of everything. Whereas previously there'd been a sense that capital expenditure was something that could be flexed downwards when you didn't have as much resources to play with. And now it's explicit that you should do the opposite. So I do think this will be very different. And if I may, there's one other crucial difference between this crisis and the financial crisis, which is that the financial crisis and the effect on the economy was caused by households suddenly realizing that they had more debt than they'd really thought about and choosing to cut back their spending. And consumer spending is the driving force of our economy. Whereas, of course, in this case, many people have been forced to stop their spending, but they would actually quite like to go out, have some leisure activities, go shopping on the high street. And so the expectation is that there will be more of a bounce back, where sort of consumer demand is being deliberately forced rather than choosing to.
Okay. Lee, do you broadly agree with that argument, Lee?
Yeah, I broadly agree with it, but I just wanted to say that from everything I've heard, I think the government does recognise the fact that austerity would not necessarily be the answer to the situation we find ourselves in, and that we must use stimulus as much as possible to help people through this, to help companies through it. That's everything I'm hearing at the moment, so I'm quite positive about how that may play out. Okay.
Thank you, Lee. I've got just a quick question from Andy Noble of Boweld. David, if you can pick this up. Boweld, I think from memory, that's Boweld Trucks, so manufacturing company. Why don't companies contribute to testing their employees, hence ensuring they are safe weekly and monthly? Testing is the way out, and it's in companies' interest. I think it's a fascinating question, one that I've not really thought about, whether companies should be testing their employees as part of the return to work, David.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good suggestion. I guess the focus on testing, though, has been restricted to key workers in NHS because there's been a shortage in the capacity in the machine. As that increases, then you may well start to see corporates and businesses looking to provide testing programs for their employees as part of the measures that they implement to ensure that they have safe working environments on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. No, thank you, David. Obviously, the availability of the testing is absolutely crucial. Right, Kitty, if we can turn to you. Peter Townsend of Amwell Construction is asking a broad question about the outlook for the UK economy during the next 12 months. And as a self-described policy wonk, Kitty, as we come out of this big economic deep freeze, as you mentioned earlier, can you talk us through the general macroeconomic issues? And I know you have a fondness for figures as well, so maybe some forecasts?
Sure. Well, as I said, it's quite hard to forecast. But the baseline scenario is that the economy will contract by an extraordinary, in fact, it is contracting by an extraordinary proportion, around a third, 35% contraction quarter on quarter for the second quarter of the year. So that's the one we're in at the moment. Now, and then a kind of bounce back later on, such that by this time next year, the Office of Budget Responsibility is suggesting it might be reasonable to plan for economic activity to be roughly similar to now. to what it previously would have been. Now, this doesn't feel intuitively right because we know that there are different sectors experiencing different problems as a result of this, and it does feel like there'll be some kind of phasing. And so it doesn't, and of course, the overall effect on the government, and in particular the debt and deficit figures, will be quite extraordinary. So the amount of extra borrowing that we're going to have to do this year is in the kind of hundreds of billions, I think around 400 billion additional debt this year, and even more next year. And the actual kind of borrowing is £200 billion more. The furlough scheme costs £42 billion, and the additional money to the NHS, another 10 billion as well. So now the government's being helped in this, in a sense, because interest rates are historically low, so the cost of servicing that debt is not as high as it would have been if this had happened in a different situation. So I think, well, to sort of summarise, there are going to, different sectors are going to have different paths out of this. The key point, perhaps, that hasn't come out of this discussion is how different groups of people are being affected. The kind of Zoom conferences sitting at home who are no longer kind of able to go to sandwich shops at lunchtime, have an after work drink, browse the high street during your lunch hour. Some of those people may actually have increased savings as a result of this. But then at the other end, the more vulnerable workers, low-paid workers who are not in the health sector, have signed on to benefits, whereas they wouldn't have done that before. So there'll be less consumer demand there. So we're going to see, I think, more of a distinction between, sort of more income inequality between professional services and low-paid workers in some specific sectors, and that will lead to a scarring effect in terms of levels of unemployment well into next year, and will have a bit of an effect on consumer demand as well. So lots of optimism about a bounce back because it's forced saving rather than choosing to save, but there will be effects, I think, going into next year.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Kitty. Slightly dampened my optimism there, but let me come to you, Lee. Camilla Oakley of Capita has asked, there must be a limit, this is a nice segue from what Kitty was saying, there must be a limit on the money that the government can spend on COVID support. At what point do you think the government will stop providing support? And given the unprecedented levels of fiscal intervention, how will we not adversely affect business when we inevitably come to the repayment stage?
I think if we start with the fact of there's a finite amount of money, of course, that is correct. And at some stage, as Kitty and both Stephen referred to earlier, it will be important that those businesses that can return, where the economy and their staff can return to earnings and profit, will be vital, but that eases the burden on things like the furlough scheme. But what I think is vital is that for those industries that cannot go back to normal straight away, and there's going to be many that that's applicable to, whether it's hospitality, whether it is airlines, whatever it be, we need to really make sure that they are taken care of under the furlough scheme, and that must continue for the most vulnerable, in my view. If we're then looking at the way businesses will be asked to pay back the loans they've taken out, I think both the banks, which may, forgive me for any bankers listening in, not necessarily be known for compassionate behaviour, should be very compassionate in this. Some of the clients there are going to struggle. We cannot say for sure how quickly people return to purchasing, and as Kitty quite rightly referred to, there'll be some sectors that will have resources to do that, and some of the more vulnerable who will not have the resources to do that. So therefore, they need protecting, and they need to be, if there are difficulties in repaying loans, for that to be taken into account. I genuinely think and believe, and it's not just because I'm a former Conservative MP, I want to state that clearly, that no one will be allowed to fall over the cliff. Now, I know that is quite a statement that has been made by others in government, but I genuinely believe that is what is wanted to be achieved. And where people are falling through the gaps, it's important that they are known and that can be rectified as soon as possible. But I come back to the fact that I have great optimism of how we can come out of this. Interest rates are at an unprecedented level and being low. I think we really can take this further and get through this together and make a difference.
Okay. Thank you, Lee. Let's pick up the issue of learning points that a couple of you mentioned earlier, particularly from the 2008 recession. Stephen, if I can turn to you, Charlie Kirk of Jet Air has asked, how do you foresee the recovery of the economy in comparison with the recovery post-2008, and what are the differences? And whilst you answer this as well, if you can just perhaps briefly touch upon the examples that a lot of people are talking about Sweden, Denmark, the Nordic countries doing things slightly differently. I know you've got a particular interest in the Nordic countries, Stephen.
Yeah, I declare an interest that I'm married to a Dane, but Sweden is the outlier in this. What Sweden has done is, in essence, not had a lockdown. Schools have operated all the way through, at least for kids under 16. Most businesses, restaurants, cafes, bars have been open, but with social distancing measures. Interestingly, the impact on the economy has still been quite severe in Sweden, because a lot of people have just taken a personal choice not to go out, not to consume as much. But what I think the much smoother approach in Sweden will do, maybe in the long run, is make us think about the holistic impact of lockdown, which is, look at how cancer referrals have dropped. Look at the number of vulnerable children that are at home sometimes with abusive parents. Look at the overall impact on mental health, and who knows, awful things like suicide rates may go up because of the drastic impact on our economy. So I think we've also got to see the response to COVID-19 in the round. And what Sweden has done is said, we think that looking holistically at this issue, it's better not to have drastic measures, but better to take a smoother approach. We shall see. Time will tell in the fullness of time what impact it has on them, both as an economy and a society. In terms of learning points, I think if we cast our minds back to 2009, Gordon Brown convened the G20, and I think it's fair to say he saved the global economy from a total meltdown. And we won the war against the financial crash. The problem is that we lost the peace, because what came after that, well, as I said, was an austerity-based decision in this country. And I think that led to the economy, the recovery being much more of a U-shape or even an L-shape than it needed to be. And we lost the opportunity to have a V-shaped recovery, which we could have had if we'd had a more stimulus-based approach. I also think, let's be fair, a lot of resentment grew that certain people who were seen as the cause of the crash, particularly the banking sector, continued to pay themselves multi-million-pound bonuses. And that fed a lot of resentment, and I think that led to the rise of populism, certain nationalism. So there's a big political question we have to ask ourselves here, is let's manage this recovery in a way that is about we are all in this together, so that we can have a more cohesive society coming out of it, and a more cohesive politics, because I really worry that it could give rise to another kind of wave of nationalism and populism. And I think the other big point is making sure that the public and the private sector come together now. Let's face it, a lot of the private sector owe a certain amount to the state now. The state has really stepped up and intervened and helped out. And I think then that raises questions about, if you are registered in an offshore tax haven, if you want to continue to receive government support, you need to come onshore. Labour is calling for a moratorium on dividends and share buybacks for companies that are benefiting from government support. So I think we need to make sure that we learn the political lessons of the 2008 crisis, as well as the economic ones, and make sure that this recovery is about the country pulling together for a whole nation approach, so that we don't feed resentment and division going forward.
And that's fascinating, Stephen. Do you foresee this government doing that, taking a sort of quite a different approach? And we've had a question just come online as well that is talking about the minimum wage going up to stimulate demand and close the gap between the rich and poor, which is obviously a very subtly different message from post-08. Do you actually see that happening? Appreciate you're not in government.
Yeah, the rhetoric from the Tories going in before this crisis was about levelling up. Okay, great. I like the levelling up rhetoric. Let's see it converted into reality. And would they legislate for a moratorium on dividends and share buybacks? Would they legislate for companies that are receiving government support, or have received government support? Would they legislate for bringing, if you're saying you've got to come on shore and get out of that tax haven if you want to continue? That the proof of the pudding back is in the eating. Will the government actually take measures to ensure that we think about the broader socio-economic cohesion of our country and political cohesion of our country? Because I think, as Kitty rightly said earlier on, I think it was Kitty, that we're seeing also these inequalities are being accelerated and deepened by this crisis, because those who work with their brain are able to stay at home, keep working, keep being paid a full salary, and do it all on Zoom. People who are doing customer-facing work and hands-on work, and often also in the manufacturing sector. And those are the sectors where you've got those inequalities. So let's make sure that this crisis doesn't exacerbate those inequalities.
Well, we've just listed a few. We have just listed a few, Stephen. And Kitty, do you, given the nature of this audience, I've had a couple of extra questions saying, do you really believe that the minimum wage will actually increase? And is that a good way to stimulate demand? Kitty, your thoughts?
I don't know what they'll do with the minimum wage, except to note that it's become increasingly politicised. So if there's a desire to support low-paid workers, it would certainly be a mechanism to do so, although, of course, it's only for those who've kept their jobs. I quite like the idea of a bonus for public sector workers in some way. If it was a good year in the banking sector, they would receive a bonus. But I think, if we're talking about sort of policy response in the tax and spending space, I would frame the question slightly differently. I would say, what is it that we now realise that we value, that we can be encouraged to keep? And there's been lots of conversations about this. If we realise that we quite like that there isn't so much aircraft pollution, is now the time to tax air travel more than, say, rail, which could be subsidised? If this is the time that we think we quite like supporting our local delicatessen because we've had to, because we can't get a supermarket delivery slot, is now the time to put a tax on food miles, for example, that would support more local suppliers. And coming back to the demographics, I do personally, this is entirely my own personal view, but I do think that maybe now is the time to not have a personal savings tax-free interest allowance, for example. Seems really odd when some people have got involuntary savings. Perhaps we should scrap that to encourage people to spend a bit more.
Yeah. Just very quickly, very briefly, Lee, on a question from Philip Joyce of Travis Perkins. An interesting one that a lot of people are talking about. Are the government just underplaying the level of redundancies that will follow once the furlough finishes? Your thoughts on that, Lee, very briefly?
I hope not. I genuinely hope not. I hope that the furlough scheme, and for those, as I said earlier, that need it, continues, and that it does not mean there'll be mass redundancies. I sincerely hope that what's being done is working. Okay.
Right, moving swiftly on. David, if I can turn to you and talk about the sort of notion of winners and losers, and we've been talking about this for a while now, about the potential winners and losers that will crystallise on the back of this crisis. Neil Wallace at Dixon's car firm warehouse, which sectors do you think will have most difficulties bouncing back? Claire Slinger of Liverpool City Council, which sectors will bounce back quickly and which will suffer depleted growth? And Salman Kotwal of Euro Garages, which business sectors will take longer to resurge and why? So a lot of questions really about winners and losers. David, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area. I think the obvious answer would be to look at the FTSE index to see which companies have seen their share price increase during the pandemic. Those companies involved in healthcare, tech, and staple products like food and other household items have unsurprisingly fared well. But I think over the longer term, the picture may be slightly more nuanced once we move into a kind of steady state. I think the factors that are likely to influence who wins and who loses may come down to a combination of which businesses can emerge quickest from the consequences of lockdown. You know, the longer a business is paralysed, the greater the chances are that we won't see them survive. And sadly, we've seen this clearly in the case of non-food retail, with household names like Debenhams, Oasis Warehouse, and others closing their doors for good. Businesses that have cash reserves and strong balance sheets to carry them through will clearly be in a better position than those that don't. And the government is yet to announce its plan for phasing out of lockdown. Hopefully we'll hear more from Boris this weekend on that. Many people previously thought that there would be a sector-based approach to emergence. I think what's more likely, though, given that minimising risks of transmission of the virus will guide all aspects of release from lockdown, is that emergence is more likely to be linked to workplace type rather than sector. So, for example, grouping emergent strategies around leisure and well-being, office, non-food retail, factory, industrial, distribution, logistics. The point being that the quicker a business can mobilise its workforce, shore up its supply chain and start delivering for customers, the more likely it is to be a survivor. Turning to the point around who's going to be hit hardest, well, three of the hardest hit industries, which will probably need specific and targeted support over the medium term, are the airlines, hotels, and pubs and restaurants. You know, all have seen catastrophic drops in revenues, and without government support, it's difficult to see how any of them will have enough reserves to weather the storm.
So, thank you, David. I'll come back to hospitality and tourism in a moment. Just last question briefly for you, David, from Alex Seaborn of Forest Garden PLC. An interesting question, and perhaps from your insight as a practitioner, what are your views on market consolidation over the next 6-12 months? Are we likely to see it?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, we may well do. You know, there may be forced consolidation, frankly, for companies to survive, and we may see that in particular sectors, companies using that as a means to shore up their balance sheets. I suspect the answer is yes, and we're more likely to see that in the sectors that have been most adversely impacted as a result of the lockdown arrangements.
Okay. Well, no, that would be good for you, David, that consolidation on a personal level. But Lee, can I turn to you on this? David touched on it, the hospitality and tourism sectors, which I know is close to your heart from a personal and professional point of view, Lee, no doubt. A number of questions. Rob Pitcher, the CEO of Revolution Bars, has asked specifically in relation to extending the grants to businesses with an RV over the 51, which have obviously been forgotten. I don't know if you have any insight specifically in relation to that. Rachel McQueen from Marketing Lancashire, hi Rachel, has talked about business support measures being announced for Scotland, and which I think of £20 million for the creative tourism and hospitality SMEs being announced recently. Are we looking to replicate that in England with some direct targeted support? And can some of those decisions be devolved to English regions in particular? Kate McNally of Vertica Adventure, based over in Northern Ireland, has referred to leisure and tourism being a huge contributor to the Northern Irish economy, and what additional initiatives can be placed there to protect jobs. And finally, Ed Hancock of Marston's, specifically talking about the post-lockdown return, where there will be partial reduced capacity, as we've seen with the social distancing. What support the sector will need to get through that partial return phase, because many of those businesses won't be viable running at, say, 50% capacity.
Thank you, Max. Can we take that in order? If I can start with, and Kitty, forgive me for this, I know you mentioned about maybe an extra air tax. I think in the short term, that would be a disaster. We need to get tourism back into our country, all regions of our country, and that will mean that the airline industry, which is going through a difficult time this present juncture anyway, will need to be competitive, because that will get tourism back certainly into our major cities. Now, with regard to the hospitality industry, they are, without any question, suffering as much as anyone, and could continue a little longer. I don't want to be negative in any shape or form, that's just being realistic. Yes, I believe that the leisure industry does need that. I think that could be carried out by way of our local authorities, and obviously being given the resources to carry that out, because there's some areas of the country which are far more tourist areas than others, and I'm thinking I'm not going to name every tourist area in Britain, but there's many of them. So yes, I do think that help in that sector needs to be looked at in great depth as we come out of lockdown, because certainly they will not be coming out of lockdown with fingers snapped and backs in order. That's not going to happen. Likewise, I think if I take one local to me, one hotel local to me, sadly, I believe, has closed down. I don't think they're planning on reopening when this is over, because they've covered up all their signs of the owners. Now, that is a big part of our local area, and I would want to see a hotel coming into that, but they would have to require some sort of help to do so. And the hotels which are obviously at the moment pretty empty will not be full overnight. We must, as a country, look at helping those. And I think this year is going to be staycation year in a big way. And to that end, we're going to have to put finances into that. But I believe it should be done through the regions who know their areas better than anyone.
Lee, can you hear me, Lee?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Just the Raising the Bar campaign that Rob pictured, that's something I know we're talking about and we can pick up separately with the relevant businesses, etc. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to move swiftly on, conscious of time. I want to turn to Stephen, if I may, and just talk about your particular interest in the UK manufacturing industrial strategy, Stephen, which inevitably will need rebooting. Just a couple of minutes, really, on your thoughts in relation to that, particularly in the context of the lack of a long-term strategy that we've had in the UK for a while.
Yeah, that sort of third bit of my rescue, recovery, reform, I think the reform piece, there's a big opportunity here to finally have a proper industrial strategy in this country. In the 1970s, manufacturing accounted for about 30% of our GDP. Since then, it's collapsed and it's below 10% now. I think it's around 9%. And that actually is the root cause of many of the structural weaknesses in the British economy. A massive shift of money, wealth, talent and resources into London and the southeast, away from the rest of the country, and an unhealthy shift away from manufacturing and into services. And our economy is just far too dominated by services now. And I say that in knowledge that many of the people on this call are in the services sector. The services sector provides a tremendous benefit to the British economy, but we've just got an unbalanced model. It's very unhealthy for our economics and politics to see so many left behind regions. The gap between London and the southeast as the wealthiest part of our country and the northeast and also Wales, where my constituency is, that is the biggest gap in the entire industrialised world. So the way to close that gap is to rebuild our manufacturing sector. That means an industrial strategy that enables us to be competitively priced on energy, that has a proper procurement strategy so that government infrastructure is using British products rather than, we've got a situation where the MOD is building a new fleet of frigates with Swedish steel, which is completely crazy. And I think we also need a root and branch reform of the banking sector so that we have a banking sector that actually lends to business, and particularly to businesses in the manufacturing sector, based very much on the German Sparkassen model. And the other point I would make finally on this need for a stronger industrial base in our country is the debacle around PPE and ventilators just shows that we're far too reliant on lengthy, complex supply chains, and particularly supply chains which go all the way to China. For our economic security and our national security, we must look to reshore our manufacturing capability and to shorten our supply chains in order to reduce our strategic dependence on China. So there's a big economic argument, an equality argument for a better and stronger manufacturing sector, but there's also a big national security argument for it.
I mean, that's an interesting one, Steve, isn't it? The so-called reckoning with China as part of the recovery and this economic resurgence. And you talk about rebooting the manufacturing strategy in response to that. Is that something that can be done quickly, Stephen? Is that something that can be the reckoning with China inevitably will come? But are we able to do that in the short term?
Well, no, this has got to be a long-term strategy. And that's, I think, one of the big problems. We've had too much short-term politics. So I hope that there'll be an opportunity for a cross-party approach on this. Infrastructure is a classic example where you have infrastructure decisions which take far longer than an electoral term. So you need a cross-party approach so that we can land a proactive industrial strategy where government and the manufacturing sector are working in tandem with each other. We have an incredibly strong university sector in this country. We should be using that to develop clusters of high-tech manufacturing businesses outside London and the southeast, outside Cambridge and Oxford as well, frankly, so that we can actually have an industrial policy that builds foundations right across our economy. And that, of course, that's not going to be done overnight, but we've got to recognise that the structural weaknesses of the UK economy are one of the reasons that we, I think, have struggled to be as resilient as we could be in dealing with a crisis like this, and also in terms of dealing with the crisis going back to 2008.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Right, conscious we've got 10 minutes left, and I've got about 4 questions left, including a really interesting one, which is the B word, which we'll come on to in a moment. So I think if I turn to you, Lee, 60 seconds on this, please. At the issue of the high street in our towns and cities. Fardad Amir Saidi of Mansfield District Council, who heads regeneration there, has talked about town centres struggling economically over the last few years, and how does the current situation impacts on the ideas and the funding and the innovation, the levelling up that we've been talking about is on Boris's agenda to revitalise those town centres. And then secondly, Stephanie Hall of Manchester City Council, slightly wider question around the future of our towns and cities in the context of people not working as much in our cities and towns, and what impact that might have on city centre living, which obviously Manchester has seen an explosion of, in particular amongst many other cities in the last few years. Just a minute or two on that, Lee.
First off, I think the regeneration of our high streets is vital. We have to look at them in a different way. A project that was introduced last year as a pilot called the Open Door Project, where empty shops were taken and used for community usage, but increasing the footfall for the other shops in the high street, I'm told in analysis is working, and where I ran it personally in days gone by, it worked perfectly. I do believe that high streets are a vital hub and cog, and as I think Kitty referred to earlier, we've seen it in the last few weeks, where people are now going to their high streets, yes, because there isn't an alternative, but I do think there's a knock-on where people will continue to go to their local fishmonger, etc., etc. And I genuinely believe that through local authorities again, and you'll notice I major quite heavily on local authorities because I believe they are the hub to taking things forward across the country. It doesn't all have to be centralised, it can be regionalised, and even on a much more local basis. And just to finish on, I do believe that the resources that have been put there should be enhanced, and our local high streets must thrive. Everyone, both nationally and locally, must do everything in their powers to achieve that.
And Lee, specifically on the more devolved powers, whether it's mayoral or the English argument, are we expecting to see that in the next couple of years, do you think?
I personally believe we are. I think we will see much more powers being devolved to local government. As we're seeing in some ways now through the crisis we're going through, where on the ground, the wonderful work being done by our key workers and frontline people across all of our local authorities, as well as obviously all the more national institutions, sometimes goes unrecognised. But I know there's people in town halls up and down this country the whole time now making sure that services are provided, and that needs to be enhanced and recognised.
Okay. Thank you, Lee. All right, turning to our penultimate question, we've had a lot of questions on the whole issue of the new normal. So if I can turn to Kitty and David on this. Starting with you, David. Martin Hawthorne of Highwood Group is very much asking about what is the new normal. Other similar questions are really around Build Back Britain Better. And I know the CBI have got that campaign going as well, amongst others. Komal Saley of Quintessentially has talked about, are we likely to need a new agile workforce and to navigate through the next 12 months? Graham Hutton, Baker Estates, what permanent changes do you see that may be embedded in our economy? that may happen? And then finally, Simon Hewitt, a first title, does the panel think the fundamental changes to staff working pattern lockdown has forced will ultimately have an impact on the historically robust office sector? David, turn to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I think history's taught us that material, structural, societal change generally only comes about because of some type of major adverse event like World War or global pandemics. So I think as a result of the coronavirus disease of 2019, we will see a new normal emerge, and I don't think we will revert to type after this. Just quickly, I think the biggest change that will affect people that work in offices will be that agile workforce. I think the psychology of working from home has changed forever. I think people won't feel guilty about working from home, as people will no longer be suspicious of those working from home. And I think the big take-up in collaboration tech tools like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and WebEx means that we're much more connected in a way that we weren't necessarily before, so that you can have that agile workforce going forward.
Well, I can assure you, David, I'm looking forward to getting back to the office. I don't know about you, but
I quite like being in my home office, to be honest.
So, Kitty, just on a more macroeconomic level, you've already mentioned a few things around transport and on things that will permanently change. Do you think economically will permanently change, or we will revert to type?
I think what's going to happen is that previous changes will be accelerated, and we've had some mention of this before. But companies that are weak, their demise or their last chance, their demise has come forward, and their last chance has been taken away. So, in Treasury speak, as far as the government economists are concerned, this might be a problem in the short term, but it's not necessarily a problem in the longer term. There's this concept of Schumpeter destruction, which is basically survival of the fittest in economic policy. And so if you've got a weak manager who hasn't been able to digitize their company and is now completely destroyed by this crisis, and so the firm goes under, that's bad news for their employees. But their employees might actually be more creative than the previous company was and can go and start new businesses. So I think there will be a sort of a hope that in the medium term, productivity will actually be massively improved. On the point of home working, I was interested that David and you both had different takes on this. I think what it will come down to is a little bit what employees want, but mainly how firms, and this will vary company to company, how firms perceive productivity has been affected by home working. And if they think actually productivity has gone down, then obviously they'll want to bring people back. But in the short term, I think the constraint will be transport, because I can't see how the rush hour is going to be able to come back with social distancing requirements. So I don't know if that's an opportunity for electric bike manufacturers or scooters, or whether it simply means that a lot of us are going to be forced to continue working from home because there's no safe way of getting us into the office. But I suspect that issue around public transport will be the real driver for change in the short term.
No, thank you for that. And you mentioned Schumpeter's destruction theory. I was introduced to that, the creative destruction principle that he has, only recently by clients. And then if anyone hasn't read it, I'd encourage you to do so, because it's a pretty versatile sort of theory that you can draw down in all sorts of walks of life. I'm halfway through reading that. Just before we go on to the final question, a fascinating question which touches on what you said, Kitty, from Andrew Hick of Cavendish Hawke, is that does the panel agree that the current crisis highlights the need for technological infrastructure, high-speed broadband, etc., to supersede transport infrastructure to ensure economic growth and regional inclusion in that growth? You probably agree with that, Kitty, wouldn't you?
Yes, I mean, it's quite clear that we couldn't have had this meeting if we didn't have sufficient broadband capability. And I think the real necessity of making sure the whole country is extremely connected now becomes massively obvious to us.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see, and acceleration of that. And I'm sure that the telecommunications companies will be making that point very clearly to the regulators as well. So that might be an
absolutely. And I think that really, for me, deals with Sarah Fricker's question of IOP publishing, which I think is the Institute of Physics. And she asked, how should we prepare ourselves for possibly a second or even third wave? That's not very optimistic of you, Sarah, but I think what we have been talking about in relation to the new normal and those refocuses should very much help ourselves to prepare for what let's hope will not be a second or third wave. Final question. We've saved the best till last. We've had a lot of questions on this. I think I'll turn to you, Stephen, on this one, and it's the B word. And Mark Bowles of the car stores, can the UK really afford Brexit now, given what is happening in the world? Shelley Lawson of Frog Bikes is asking about what the likely impact is on the transition and the prospects of a deal. And finally, Alistair Kilgour of Pentland Brands, are any changes in the approach to Brexit outcome expected as a result of this crisis? So is it inevitable, Stephen, that we are going to have an extension to the transition period?
Well, just on one of the questions, should Brexit go ahead? I think it absolutely has to, and that question is settled, of course, both by the referendum and then successive general elections.
Is it, Stephen? Is it?
Delivery. So we have left the EU, and that will continue to be the case. I don't see any chance of that being reversed in the foreseeable future. The question of whether or not the transition period should be extended is a much more controversial one. I think it's a question here really of whether it's politics versus common sense, and I fear that politics will prevail. To me, the common sense answer to that question is clearly the transition period should be extended. We are going to have businesses across the length and breadth of our country on their knees from this crisis. They've already had a huge whack with the COVID-19 stick. To give them another whack with a stick in the shape of significant disruption to their trading practices, a lot more regulatory burdens and administrative burdens, even under the future relationship deal that the government wants to have, I think would be very unfair to those businesses. And the way to get round that is to extend the transition period for a year, so a time-limited, almost like a bailout, really, to just give companies the chance to deal with one crisis at a time. There's also
is that going to be your position, Stephen?
Sorry?
Is that going to be your position, Stephen? And do you know what your party's position is on that?
Yes, certainly within the party, very serious concerns being raised about that it looks like if we don't get an extension, it'll be no deal because the talks are not going very well and the no deal disruption would be huge. But Keir is also very clearly saying we need to see how this next round of talks go on the 11th of May. And if there is a breakthrough, then of course there's no need for the transition period to be extended in principle. But if this round of talks go as badly as the last do, there seems to be still a very large gap between the negotiating parties. Then I think we'll start to see more concerns being raised about the impact on business. And there's also very practical concerns. I mean, we estimate that we need something like an extra 50,000 customs officials or not officials, but people who are trained across businesses to be able to deal with these new customs arrangements. The academy that the government set up to train those people has been closed down because of the COVID crisis. So there's some very practical concerns about whether we're actually going to be ready to deal with the additional regulatory and administrative burdens.
And one final question for you, Stephen, on that, and I'll bring you in, Kitty, for your thoughts. But do you think it is feasible that we will leave in December with no extension and no deal?
I think it's absolutely feasible because, as I say, I think politics is going to beat common sense in this. The government's rhetoric is hardening. We had Michael Gove at the Future Relationship Select Committee. His rhetoric's hardening. I've pressed Dominic Raab on this in the chamber. The rhetoric is hardening around under no circumstances will we request an extension. And I think that they are kind of boxing themselves into a corner on this. Unfortunately, it looks therefore like, and I can't see the EU shifting that far because I just don't think the EU will be prepared to kind of be held to ransom in that way either. I think it's a very worrying situation where, unfortunately, I think a kind of political ideology is going to triumph over the economic and health and security of the British people.
Kitty, do you have a different view at all, or?
No, I've always had the view that they would not extend any negotiation timetable. You know, this is a government that got its majority by saying it would get Brexit done. I actually, and I'm sure this may not be welcome to many people on this call, but I am of the view that the current crisis makes it politically easier, makes Brexit politically easier for the government. So the opposite to what your question was implying. And that's because it enables a little bit of protectionist nationalism, economic nationalism to come to the fore. You know, we want to sort of repivot our supply chain so that, you know, British businesses who are looking for new opportunities coming out of COVID can make sure that they have those opportunities as the manufacturing sector recovers, etc. And I think that would be an argument that is easy to communicate and easy to understand. So just as, for example, furloughed workers now are being encouraged to go and work in the agriculture sector for the fruit picking season when previously it would have been staffed by migrants, that's a very good opportunity of making a Brexit problem go away because of the current crisis. And I think we'll see that piecemeal across the whole economy.
Okay, well, that's for some on the call, particularly in business, well, might be a depressing tune. I don't know, Lee or David, if you have a different view to that, do you want to share it? Provided do you have a different view, or do you both concur?
I said at the start that I'm an optimistic person that I believe we will leave and have a deal.
And have a deal, yeah. Okay, David?
I agree with Kitty's analysis.
Okay, well, for what it's worth, I'm actually going to disagree with all of you, and I believe there will be an extension to the transition period. So, but my predictions have been notoriously wrong over the last 12, 24 months, but I will share that.
Bet.
Yeah, I'll share that one. We are going to finish off with just a couple of maybe 3 or 4 quick fire questions, which necessitates only a yes or no answer. And that includes you, David, as a lawyer. No depends or anything like that. This is a yes or no. And then we'll finish up just a couple of minutes over time. So 4 quick fire questions, which have come out of the questions from the participants. So we'll go with you first, Stephen, and then we'll go clockwise. Vaccine and completely back to normal by the end of 2020?
No.
David?
No.
Kitty?
No.
Lee?
No.
Okay, well, that's a resounding 4 no's. The next question is, will Boris still be our Prime Minister in 2024? Stephen?
We will have beaten him in a general election in 2023.
Stephen, it's a yes or a no.
So,
That's
well,
no, then.
The answer is no, because Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister in 2023.
That's the inevitable reply from Stephen Kinnock, Labour MP. David?
Yes.
Yes. Kitty?
I think he'll serve a full term.
Yeah, that's what we're getting at. Yes. Lee?
Yes.
Yeah. Which I think, to answer Steve, the next question, will Keir be the Prime Minister in 2024? That's a yes from Stephen. David, Kitty, Lee?
No.
Perfectly possible.
No.
Okay. And we are going to finish off with one final question, which a couple of participants have asked. Trump or Biden? So we are very quickly going to move on to a whole new current affair topic post-pandemic. I suppose we'll still be in the pandemic, but the narrative will move on quickly to Trump or Biden. So quite a difficult one, this one, to finish off with. We'll go with you first, Lee. Trump or Biden to win?
Joe Biden.
Biden. Kitty?
I'm going to say Trump because I think he's playing to his audience and knows what he's doing.
David?
I don't think we've seen the best from Trump yet, so it will be Biden. He's bound to mess it up, further mess it up between now and the election.
Okay, so we've got 2 from Biden, 1 from Trump. Stephen?
Also an optimist, so I'll say Biden. It'll be very interesting to see if this crisis brings politics back towards the centre or whether it continues to polarize us. I, as an optimist, believe that we will start to see a desire for more pragmatism and centrism. I hope so anyway.
Okay, so that's 3-1 to Biden, although I should say these panelists are not quite representative of the great American public. So, but thank you very much to all of you panelists for your insights. It's been fascinating. We could have, done a whole day on this and given a number of questions and topics, etc. So, thank you for being sort of insightful and succinct in places. Thank you to all of the audience for getting involved. Like I said earlier, I apologise if I couldn't raise your questions, but please do get in touch, keep talking to us. And I suppose it's all about Sunday now, so I certainly am stocking up on the Doritos and the drinks for the big blockbuster on Sunday, which is Boris's blockbuster, the next phase of the lockdown. So we eagerly anticipate that. But until we speak again, thank you very much and good afternoon.